The snow had fallen all night, covering the valley like a clean white sheet over something the world had forgotten. The fences were buried up to their rails, and the old barn leaned under the weight of the cold. By morning, when the wind slowed, you could almost hear the land breathing again, quiet, tired, waiting. I parked the truck at the edge of the field. It had been 15 years since I'd seen this place. 15 years since I'd walked away from everything that still haunted my dreams. I told myself I'd sold it, left it, buried it, but grief doesn't stay buried, it waits. And this morning it called me home. Before I even stepped out, I saw her. A white mare, older now, her mane tangled and gray at the roots. She stood by the same fence where my boy used to brush her every day after school. I froze. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. She had to be gone by now, she was almost 20 when I left. But there she was, standing in the snow, staring right at me, like she'd been expecting this moment all along. The wind pushed against my coat as I walked closer. My boots sank deep into the snow, each step slower than the last. She didn't move. Just watched me. The closer I got, the harder my throat burned. "You still remember, don't you?" I whispered. My voice cracked on the word. The mare flicked her ear, then gave a faint, broken nicker. It sounded more like a sigh than a greeting. And that's when it hit me, she wasn't just waiting for anyone. She was waiting for me. I reached out a trembling hand, but stopped inches from her face. The last time I'd been this close, I was shouting, not speaking. And she had seen everything. I stood there in the snow, my hand half raised, afraid to touch what time had not yet taken. The white mare's breath rose between us in soft clouds, each one fading slow into the cold air. Her eyes, still deep, still kind, studied me the way a soul studies a confession. "You shouldn't still be here," I murmured. "I left too long ago." She took a step forward, hooves crunching softly. Her muzzle brushed my glove, and that single touch broke something open inside me. I let my hand rest against her neck. Beneath the tangled mane, her skin was warm and trembling. "You've been waiting," I said. "All this time." The barn door creaked behind us. I turned and saw the same crooked frame my boy once repaired with nails too long and hands too small. The sight of it burned. Every nail, every board carried his laughter, the kind that used to fill this field. I led the mare toward the barn, my fingers wrapped lightly around the rope that still hung from her halter. The old boards groaned under our weight. Inside, the smell of hay and dust clung to the air. In one corner, the broken saddle still sat where I'd left it the night I walked away. I could almost hear my wife's voice from that night, soft, breaking. "If you leave now, you'll lose more than this land." And I had. I'd lost them both. The mare turned her head toward me as if she remembered the sound of her too. I found an old blanket and threw it over her back. "You've waited long enough, girl," I said. "You don't owe me forgiveness." But she stayed close, breathing slow beside me. The silence between us didn't accuse or forgive, it simply held. And in that stillness, I realized I hadn't come back for land or memory. I had come back for mercy. I spent the next few hours in the barn, not speaking much, just listening, to the crackle of the old rafters, to the slow rhythm of her breathing, and to the echoes of a house that no longer stood. I found an old brush in a crate, stiff with age, and ran it gently through her mane. Each stroke brought up flecks of dust and bits of straw, but she didn't flinch. She leaned into it like a creature too tired to resist kindness. "You remember when my boy brushed you?" I said quietly. "He used to hum while he worked. Said you liked the sound." Her ears twitched, and for a heartbeat I could almost see him again, barefoot, hair a mess, laughing when she nudged him for another apple. That memory hit harder than I expected. I had left this place to escape it, but now it played in front of me like a film I couldn't pause. When the wind picked up again, snowflakes slipped through the gaps in the wood, landing soft on her white coat. I threw another blanket over her back, the same way I used to for his sake more than hers. She turned her head slightly, eyes half closed, the way someone does when they recognize a lullaby. I spoke then to no one in particular. "He never stopped talking about you, you know. Even when things got bad. Even when I made them worse." The mare let out a long breath, a sound halfway between sorrow and comfort. I smiled weakly. "You're all I've got left of him." Outside, the clouds were breaking, sunlight pushing through in thin gold strips across the snow. It fell through the barn slats and landed on her like a blessing. And for the first time in 15 years I whispered, "Thank you for waiting." That night, the valley sank into a silence I hadn't heard in years. No wind, no coyotes, just the soft creak of the barn and the slow shuffle of the mare's hooves on straw. I sat on an overturned bucket near the old stove, a lantern flickering by my boot. The light threw long, trembling shadows across the wood, and every time it reached her face, she looked like a ghost from another life. I poured some warm water into a bucket, mixing in what oats I could find from the storage bin. "It isn't much," I told her. "But it's something." She sniffed the water, then began to drink. I watched the rhythm of her throat as she swallowed, the quiet grace of it. "You're tougher than you look, girl," I said. "Always were." After she finished, I leaned back, staring at the ceiling beams blackened by years of smoke. The smell of old ash clung to everything. My boy used to climb those beams, laughing when I told him he'd fall and break his neck. He never did. Not until that night when the barn burned. I closed my eyes, the memory cutting clean through the quiet. Flames rising like anger, his voice shouting for me, the mare screaming in her stall. I'd gotten her out but not him. That was the night I buried more than a son, I buried myself. The mare shifted, her hooves scraping softly as she moved closer. Her head rested near my shoulder, warm and heavy. I didn't move. Couldn't. "You remember too, don't you?" I whispered. "You saw me run. You saw me fail him." She breathed out, steady, forgiving, and I felt the weight I'd carried for 15 winters start to melt just a little. Outside, the snow had stopped. Inside, for the first time in years, I didn't feel completely alone. Morning came pale and silver, the kind of light that makes everything look like a memory. Frost still clung to the barn door, and my breath hung in the air when I spoke. "You made it through another night," I said softly. The mare's ears flicked at my voice, and she turned toward me, eyes calm and aware. I gave her a handful of oats from my palm. She chewed slow, the sound steady and grounding. "You never did quit, did you?" I said with a small smile. "Guess I could learn a thing or two from you." Outside, the sky was clearing. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney of a neighbor's house far down the valley, but otherwise, the world looked untouched. I stepped out with her, the snow squeaking under my boots, her hooves leaving neat prints beside mine. The old fence creaked as I opened it, and she walked through as though she'd never left. In the sunlight, she didn't look frail anymore. Her coat caught the light like glass, shimmering with shades of silver and pearl. The wind ran through her mane, and for a brief second I saw my boy again, running beside her, arms wide, laughing without breath. I had to close my eyes. The ache in my chest was too real to hide. "You're all that's left of him," I said. "All that's left of me too." She nickered softly, nudging my arm. Her warmth pushed through the cold, reminding me of something I'd forgotten, how forgiveness feels. When I looked at her again, she was standing by the same post where he used to tie her up every night before dinner. She lowered her head slightly, waiting. "Still your spot, huh?" I whispered. "Some things never change." And in that small act, her stillness, her patience, I realized she hadn't been waiting for years. She'd been keeping this place alive, waiting for me to come home to it. As the sun rose higher, I found myself walking the same worn paths I used to know by heart. Every step pulled another ghost out of the snow. My boy's laughter echoing down the hill, my wife's voice calling from the porch, the smell of stew drifting through a kitchen that no longer stood. The house was gone now, only a cracked stone foundation and a rusted stove half buried under weeds. I stopped where the front door used to be and looked back at the barn. The white mare stood by the fence, still watching, tail flicking gently in the breeze. She didn't wander, didn't graze. Just stood there as if making sure I wouldn't disappear again. "You always were the keeper of this place," I said under my breath. I knelt and brushed snow off one of the stones. Underneath, the ground was cold and hard. I knew what rested there. We'd buried him near the apple tree that never bore fruit again. The cross I built back then had long since fallen, the name carved into it faded by years of rain. My throat tightened as I ran my fingers across the rough wood. "I'm sorry, son," I whispered. "For leaving. For running when I should have stayed." The wind picked up, sweeping through the valley, carrying with it the faint creak of the barn door. I turned and saw the mare lift her head toward the sound. She gave a small, gentle nicker, the same one she used to make when my boy brushed her mane. That sound tore right through me. I walked back, boots sinking deep into the snow. When I reached her, I laid my forehead against hers. Her breath warmed my face. "You kept him here, didn't you?" I said, voice shaking. "You kept him alive long after I stopped trying." The mare blinked slowly, her breath steady. And in her quiet, I found more forgiveness than I'd ever earned. The day drifted on, slow and quiet, as though the world itself was careful not to disturb us. I stayed near the barn, mending what I could, the latch that had rusted through, the fence that leaned too far, the roof that let in more light than it should. Each nail I drove into the wood felt like an apology spoken in silence. The white mare followed me everywhere I went. She didn't demand attention, didn't ask for anything. She simply stayed close, her hooves crunching softly behind me, her breath misting in the air beside mine. Every time I looked over my shoulder, she was there, calm, patient, as if she knew I needed her presence more than she needed mine. By late afternoon, the light had turned honey gold. The snow glowed with it, and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth. I leaned against the fence, watching her move across the field. Her steps were slow but sure, her mane catching bits of sunlight that made her look younger, almost untouched by time. That's when I saw something glinting beneath the old apple tree, half buried in the snow. I walked over and brushed it free with my glove. It was a small brass tag, dull with rust, tied to a torn piece of leather. I turned it over in my palm and read the faint engraving, Daisy. I felt my chest tighten. My boy had named her himself. Said she looked like the wild daisies that used to grow by the creek. I walked back toward her, holding the tag in my shaking hand. You kept it? I said, voice breaking. All this time. She stopped in front of me, lowering her head. I slid the tag gently onto her halter. It looked worn, but it belonged there, like the last missing piece of something sacred. You and him, I whispered. Neither of you ever gave up on me. She pressed her nose against my chest, and for the first time in 15 years, I let myself cry without shame. That night, I built a small fire just outside the barn. The valley was dark, the kind of dark that feels endless, but the flames made a soft circle of warmth that reached far enough to catch the mare's coat in a faint orange glow. She stood near me, quiet, the tag on her halter glinting every time the fire cracked. I stared into the flames for a long while. You know, I said, voice low, I used to think running away was the same as moving on. I picked up a stick, poking the coals. Sparks floated into the air like tiny ghosts. Turns out you don't outrun what you love. You just circle back to it when you're tired enough. The mare shifted her weight, her tail flicking against the cold air. I blamed myself for everything, I continued. For the fire, for losing him, for breaking her heart. Maybe I deserved to. But I don't think she'd want me to stay lost forever. The wind blew softly through the open fields, carrying the faint sound of the creek thawing. It was the same sound that used to lull my boy to sleep when he was small. I closed my eyes and breathed it in. You've kept this place alive, I whispered. Even when I couldn't. When I opened my eyes again, the mare had stepped closer, her muzzle inches from my shoulder. She leaned in, resting her head there like an old friend trying to remind me I wasn't alone. I lifted my hand and stroked her mane, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of the tag. Daisy, I said softly, tasting the name for the first time in years. You waited for me. Guess it's my turn now. Above us, the stars came out, bright, endless, and forgiving, the same way she'd been all along. The next morning came quiet and golden, the kind of dawn that feels like mercy. The frost had melted off the barn door and thin mist floated over the fields. Daisy stood by the fence, head lifted toward the sun. Her coat shimmered, white turned almost silver in that light. I brought her a bucket of water and a handful of feed. You've earned more than this, I said, smiling faintly. But it's all I've got till I make the trip into town. She nudged my shoulder gently before lowering her head to eat. That simple act, so ordinary, so alive, filled the space around us with something I hadn't felt in years. I spent the morning fixing the barn roof, humming a tune I hadn't thought of since my boy's laughter used to echo through these beams. Every sound felt different now, not heavy with loss but softer, warmer, like the valley was learning to breathe again. When I climbed down the ladder, Daisy was waiting near the gate. I walked over and leaned against the post beside her. She turned her head, brushing her muzzle against my arm. You know, I said, I used to think forgiveness was something you had to earn. But maybe it's something that waits for you instead. She blinked slow, her breath curling into the morning air. I took off my hat and looked toward the hills. He'd be a man now, I whispered. Probably laugh at me for talking to a horse. My throat tightened. But I think he'd be proud I came back. Daisy gave a soft nicker like she was agreeing. The wind carried the sound across the open land, and for the first time I didn't feel haunted by the past. I felt held by it. The valley wasn't empty anymore. It was home again, rebuilt quietly between two survivors who refused to forget. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm between us found its own heartbeat. Each sunrise carried a little less ache, and each sunset left behind a little more peace. I started tending to the pasture again, repairing the broken troughs, pulling out the weeds that had crept too close to the barn. Daisy followed me wherever I went, steady and sure, like she had decided she wouldn't let me vanish again. Sometimes I'd catch her standing near the apple tree at dusk, her breath rising in the cool air. I'd stop whatever I was doing and watch her, still, graceful, her tail swaying gently like she was keeping time with some old song only she could hear. Every time the wind brushed through her mane, I felt my boy close, his laughter echoing faintly between the hills. One evening, the sky burned gold and crimson, the air thick with that sweet scent that comes just before spring. I sat on the porch steps, coat pulled tight, and Daisy wandered toward me, her hooves soft on the thawing ground. She lowered her head until our foreheads touched. The weight of her trust, her quiet understanding, said everything words could never manage. You know, I said quietly, I don't think forgiveness is something you give. I think it's something you return to, when the world finally lets you. She breathed against my cheek, warm and patient. I smiled, tracing the brass tag on her halter with my thumb. You and him, you waited long enough. Guess it's my turn to stay. The horizon glowed faintly, stars waking in the distance. I could almost feel the land settle, the way a soul exhales after years of holding its breath. And as Daisy stood beside me, her mane brushing against my shoulder, I finally understood, the waiting had never been punishment. It had been love that refused to give up. Spring arrived slowly, almost shy, like it wasn't sure we were ready for it. The snow retreated in patches, revealing grass that had been waiting just as long as I had. The valley softened, turning from gray to green. The creek ran again, steady and sure, whispering through the rocks the way it did when my boy was small. Daisy was different now. Her coat shone clean in the morning sun, her steps lighter, her eyes brighter. I let her roam the pasture most days, though she never wandered far. She'd graze near the fence, always turning her head toward the barn whenever I moved inside, as if to remind herself that I was still there. One morning I opened the barn doors wide and let the sunlight pour in. The air smelled of hay and rain. I stood there a long while just watching her. Something inside me shifted then, a quiet knowing that the past didn't own me anymore. It had taught me, scarred me, softened me, but it no longer chained me. I walked out toward her, slow and calm. You did it, Daisy, I said softly. You kept the promise I couldn't keep. She lifted her head, her mane rippling in the breeze, and took a few steps toward me. I brushed her face, feeling the warmth of her skin beneath my hand. You've carried this place, this memory all by yourself, I continued. But you don't have to anymore. We'll keep it together now. She nickered, low and content. The world around us was alive again. Birds calling, grass swaying, the sound of life beginning where loss had once lived. And as the sunlight stretched across the valley, I realized something I should have known long ago. Forgiveness isn't just given or found. It's built, one quiet morning, one act of kindness, one heartbeat at a time. That day the barn doors stayed open, and for the first time in 15 years I didn't look back. The days grew longer, warm and golden, and the valley bloomed in colors I'd forgotten existed. Wildflowers crawled up the fence line, bees drifted lazily between the apple blossoms, and the hills, once ghostly white, turned alive with green. I worked the land again not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Every swing of the hammer, every seed I pressed into the soil, felt like a quiet thank you to the life I'd been given back. Daisy stayed near me, her coat gleaming under the sunlight, her movements slow but strong. Sometimes she'd break into a trot across the pasture, tail flying, and for a moment I'd swear I saw my boy running beside her, barefoot, free, his laughter echoing through the air. I never chased the vision away anymore. I let it stay like a blessing. One afternoon I sat by the fence, carving a new wooden marker for the apple tree. The old one had long rotted away. I worked slowly, tracing each letter with care. For James, the boy who taught me love never leaves. When I pressed the last letter, I set it in the ground beside the tree. Daisy wandered over, sniffing the fresh wood, then rested her head on my shoulder. You remember him too, don't you? I said softly. He'd be happy we finally came home. The breeze moved through her mane, and for a second, it felt like the valley itself was breathing with us. As the sun slipped behind the hills, I leaned my hand on her neck, the warmth of her body grounding me. You waited for me when I didn't deserve it, I whispered. Guess I'll spend whatever time I've got left waiting here with you. She lifted her head, eyes catching the last gold of the day. Together we watched the sky fade into evening, quiet, content, forgiven. Moral lesson. Sometimes love doesn't shout, chase, or demand. It simply waits, through seasons, through silence, through time, until the heart is brave enough to return. When the applause faded, the auctioneer stepped forward, eyes soft, voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. He's something special, Eli, he said. You thinking of selling? I smiled faintly, shaking my head. No, I said. He's not for sale. He never was. The man nodded once, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Then I suppose he's home. The crowd stayed silent for a moment, no laughter this time, no mocking jokes. Just respect, the kind that doesn't need words. Ash stood tall beside me, ears twitching at the sound of the wind slipping through the open doors. He was still, calm, proud, everything he wasn't when I first saw him. I turned toward the light spilling into the barn. "Come on, boy," I said, giving the rope a gentle tug. "Let's go." We walked past the stalls, past the people who had once turned their backs. The air outside felt warm, filled with the smell of spring. The sky stretched wide and open above the valley, the fields washed in gold. At the top of the hill I stopped and looked back one last time. The barn looked smaller from there, like a picture from another life. Ash flicked his ears, letting out a low, contented nicker. I rested a hand on his neck. "We did it, son," I said softly. The words trembled but didn't break. "We made it." For a long moment, neither of us moved. The breeze lifted the ends of my coat, carried the smell of grass and new earth. The sun dipped lower, bathing us in its last light. I whispered, "You saved me too, Ash. You just don't know it." He brushed his nose against my shoulder, quiet and sure. Together we walked forward, leaving footprints in the damp grass that disappeared behind us with every step. The world felt wide again and forgiving. Moral lesson. Sometimes what the world calls weak is only waiting for someone to believe. Second chances don't just heal the broken, they heal the ones who give them too.